All right, welcome everybody to our very first Oxygen 360 Facebook Live presentation. I am very excited to be here today. My name is Mike Hess. I am a respiratory therapist with the COPD Foundation, and I am the project lead for the Oxygen 360 project. I am joined today by the esteemed John Linnell, who may need no introduction, but I'm going to give him a minute here to introduce himself anyway. So John, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. I'm John Linnell. I'm a COPD patient. I am not a clinician. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a respiratory therapist. So my viewpoints are mine, but they're on behalf of you, the patient. And I hope that we all learn something today from, together, and with each other about oxygen and the opportunities and problems that we currently have. I was diagnosed with COPD in late 2005. I had to leave the workforce due to my COPD in late 2011. Since then, I've gone into a lot of advocacy work, which I find it's rewarding to me because I get to work and speak with many of you. Thanks. Mike?
All right, well said. Thank you very much. So without further ado, let's jump into exactly what we are here talking about today. And that is, again, the Oxygen 360 program here. Oxygen 360 is a project that we started at the COPD Foundation for a variety of reasons. But one of the biggest issues that we see is we can look back at we're going to go back to the future a little bit here. We look back on the left-hand side of the screen here. We see back in the great year of 1987. This was the state-of-the-art cell phone technology back then, the Radio Shack Celluphone 200. I can't really tell you a lot of the specs on this particular device, but I've used one very similar, not surprisingly enough. And you can see it's fairly, what we would consider these days to be fairly bare bones. It was a great concept to be able to use a telephone from basically wherever you were, but it didn't really do much outside of making calls. And of course, back in the day, that's what telephones were for. What we see over on the right side there, the LG Wing, brand new smartphone that came onto the market earlier this year. It's got two very bright displays. It's got computers that are better than what put astronauts on the moon. It can basically do whatever you want. We've got arguably the world's knowledge at your fingertips there. And why did I pick these two particular things when we were putting this slide together? Well, we can also look back at the earliest picture or diagram I could find for an oxygen concentrator was actually from 1986, so very contemporary with that Radio Shack cellular phone. The technology for an oxygen concentrator was actually first developed in the 1970s, but I couldn't really find a lot of that. Some of that, those pictures have been kind of lost to the sands of time. This device was created by a company called the Bendix Corporation, which John, I think you were telling me they came out. They made bicycle parts also.
I think they made the gear ratios. If you had a Bendix gear ratio for your 10-speed, you were with it. You were up there.
All right. I couldn't find a lot of insight about the company myself, so I was relying on John for that one. But you can see that the device itself hasn't really changed a lot over the course of those same 35 odd years there. We can see over to the right side of the screen, this is a modern oxygen concentrator based on the same molecular sieve technology that was originally created by Bendix and Union Carbide back in the 70s and 80s. The form factor hasn't changed much. The underlying technology hasn't changed much. And so the way we interface with these, or the way we interact with these devices, also hasn't really changed much. And from a respiratory therapy perspective, John, I don't know how you feel about this, but from an RT perspective, that's kind of a problem for me.
Well, it is for me too, as a patient, because if you look at your picture of the Bendix from 1986 and compare it to the newer one from 2021, it's the same thing, except the newer one has this case around it and it's got wheels, but I guess so does the old one. It hasn't really changed. And I think an analogy, not really an analogy, COVID has forced us to adopt technology, telemedicine, remote monitoring, and things like that. I used to like to say, technology is the future. Well, guess what, folks? The future is now. The future is here. I've got devices like a pulse oximeter that is Bluetooth capable and goes right to my phone. I've got a home pulse oximeter, I'm sorry, a spirometer that I can blow into, and all of a sudden my FEV1 is displayed on my phone. Everything is advancing except oxygen technology. And we need to do something about that. And I think that's one of the goals of Oxygen360. And what Mike and the team that I'm happy to be on are hoping to encourage researchers and inventors to do.
Absolutely. And that takes us into our next part of the presentation here, where we actually talk about what is Oxygen360. Well, we do want to bring oxygen into that modern era with Bluetooth connectivity and everything else that John was mentioning that we see in bits and pieces here and there. We want to bring everybody to the table together a little bit more consistently so that we can see some of that progress that we saw in cellular telephones and with everything else that we've seen over the last few decades. We want to bring that to the oxygen world as well. And so one of the first things we do is we're trying to partner with manufacturers and suppliers so that we can see why haven't things changed? What are some of our barriers? We're trying to talk to idea people, innovators, new inventors, fresh minds, fresh ideas, trying to see what sometimes when you don't know what's been done, sometimes you want to try some kind of wild and crazy idea, and that may take us into a new direction where we see some of that progress. We want to talk to our friends in the clinical community, physicians of all stripes, MDs, DOs. We want to talk to our nurse practitioners, our physician assistants, respiratory therapists, registered nurses, everybody in the clinical realm to figure out what are the issues that you see on your side of the stethoscope. How can we help you provide oxygen therapy to people a little bit easier? Of course, we want to talk to those people who are setting policy at a national level, those folks at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. We want to talk to our other colleagues in the payer community to figure out how we can bring some better rationality into the payment models that are out there and entice some of these idea people and everybody else to invest a little bit more in oxygen and drive that stuff forward. We also want to talk to other advocacy groups. Of course, at the foundation, our big focus is, of course, the COPD community, but we also know that there are a lot of folks out there with other conditions who are also using oxygen, and we want to amplify each other's voices so that we can be a little bit more effective. And then, of course, at the center and at the top are our patient and caregiver communities.
And this is kind of, I think, where you guys listening, hopefully many of you are patients, and or caregivers, because you're equally as important. Tell us, later we're going to give you a specific email address. We want to hear your stories, your ideas, not just gripes, but we want to hear those too. Mike and I were discussing the other day that there are two types of stories and ideas out there. The problems you've had. We need to know what the problems are. So when we go to the manufacturers and suppliers, we can say, hey, everyone is saying this is a problem, but we want to hear ideas and your journey, your success stories, why oxygen is important to you, how you use it, because the patient story is so important, especially to policymakers, to government entities. They need to know how and why we rely so much on oxygen, and we don't want to be tied to our home. I don't want to be that old man at home with a hose in my nose. I want to get out and have a life, and oxygen is what allows me to do that. So later when we get into that, please, this whole program is for you, and we can't help you if we don't know the specific issues and problems along with the success stories. Thanks.
Absolutely. I was actually on another call the other day, and I was talking about how important it is to get those, as they say, the boots on the ground. I can make assumptions as an RT and as somebody who has been, an advocate and involved with different initiatives. I can make assumptions about what's necessary and what's needed and all that sort of thing. But I would much rather take action based on facts and eyewitness accounts and everything else, rather than just my assumptions. So with those things in mind, we do have three kind of what we call prime directives. As some of you may know, if you've ever seen any of my presentations before, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, and I know the prime directive, that's the thing that is most sacred to everybody in Starfleet and the Federation. And so these are ours. We want to look for and promote new technologies. We've been able to meet a couple of people in that innovation area, those new ideas, those fresh minds. And we want to figure out ways where we can integrate those, add those to existing technology, and make things better all around. We want to make oxygen easier to get. We know that there are often supply issues, even outside the pandemic. Of course, during the pandemic, we've seen literal supply issues, but we also know that people sometimes just have trouble getting the equipment that meets their needs in the first place. We also want to make it easier to use. We want to make things as much as we can. We want to make things able to. We want to make things easier for people to carry around. As John said, he wants to get out and about. So can we make these things lighter? Can we improve battery life? Can we do all those sorts of things? And then, of course, again, we want to make sure that we are improving our educational efforts for everybody, patients, caregivers, clinicians, even the general public. We want to make sure that people out there aren't looking at the use of oxygen as something that is strange or unpleasant or something, or unpleasant's not the right word, because it's not, I'm sure it's not the greatest thing, but we want to make sure that it is not stigmatized or anything like that. And that does involve providing education to the general public. Along those lines, this is not just an Oxygen360 initiative. This is something that the entire COPD Foundation is putting a lot of effort into, including revamping our line of better living guides. Many of you may know them as originally, way back when, the Big Fat Reference Guide that then begat the Slim Skinny Reference Guides. Now the entire line is being refreshed and updated, including a new guide for better living that is focused on oxygen therapy. We can see if I can be real clever. Oops, I don't know that I can be real clever, but we'll make sure all of these links are available at the end of the program, and then also by sending out an email that will get to you folks. Well, the email is very easy. It's oxygen360@copdfoundation.org. We can answer a lot of questions on that. And of course, that'll be on screen and everything else as we get through the presentation. But this guide is very easy to access at our foundation website, and we'll also be seeing some pictures that illustrate how useful the guide can be as we get through the presentation. As I said, this is an entire foundation effort, all hands on deck, but Oxygen360 certainly represents our moonshot effort. Going back to the words even farther back than those original oxygen concentrators, going back to President Kennedy when he was first announcing our efforts to go to the moon, he said, we choose to do these things not because they're easy, but because they're hard. We recognize that this is not going to be an overnight effort. This is not just something that, oh, why haven't we done it? Nobody else must have thought of it, that kind of thing. We know this is going to take a lot of effort. And as John said, that's why we are calling on everybody out there, because we need your help. We need your guidance, we need your assistance, and we need your mentorship as we get through various stages of this program. But we do intend to win. We do intend to make progress. We know it's easy to say. We know a lot of people have said it before, but this is something that we are putting our organizational heart and soul into so that we can drive it forward. And as John mentioned, there are a lot of ways for you to get involved. John, you want to talk again a little bit about some of the stories that we can hear here?
Yeah, I can't tell you guys enough how important it is that you tell us as I mentioned earlier, you've got the good stories, plus you've got the issues. And this slide shows, tell us your stories of living well with oxygen, because that tells everyone, manufacturers, suppliers, other advocacy groups, the government, your elected officials, Medicare, CMS, why and how you use it and how it enables you to have a life. but we also need to hear the challenges. Like, for example, some of you may not do well with a pulse portable oxygen concentrator, and that limits your ability to get out and about because there are no lightweight continuous ones. And there, I mean, there's a reason for that, and it would take too long to go into, but the technology simply doesn't exist yet, and hopefully that will change. And educational needs, and your advocacy support is simply writing that letter. We're not asking you for money. We're asking you for your advocacy support to perhaps there will be outreaches where we'll want you to call or send a letter to your elected officials saying, this is what we need. Because they're not going to give you something if they don't know you need it. And they won't know you need it if you don't tell them you need it and tell them why and ask for it. So it's kind of a roundabout way, but that really is how simple it is. Or maybe you have some tips. Here's what I do. Like on COPD 360, some people talk about how to prevent your hose from tangling so you don't trip on it. That's very helpful for other people. This is your program. It's our program. When Mike and I fly to Sweden to receive the Nobel Prize for this, it's all because of you.
We'll bring
you
it.
You knew I had to throw a joke in there somewhere, Mike.
Well, the hope would be that maybe we'll have advanced all that portable oxygen by then, and we can just load everybody up on a cruise ship and sail on over.
Ooh, that would be fun.
And we'll organize that through our Oxygen360 at COPD Foundation email address that you can see on the screen right there.
Yeah, but please, I mean, write this address down. If you don't, it'll be posted later, but we want to hear from you. And any ideas, offers, suggestions, stories, challenges, it's your program, guys. It's all for you.
And another way to get involved, John mentioned a moment ago, COPD 360 Social. This is a social network that is entirely dedicated to the COPD community. Again, based on our foundation website, but there is a very strong over 50,000 folks here. You can see this was a screen capture from just the other day. 50,616 people with more joining every day from literally around the world. I always forget the number. I think we're up to 150 different countries around the world. But we can see where this is a very vibrant and energetic and energized community that asks a lot of questions about oxygen use. We talked about some of those tips that are out there. These are questions that are taken from resources around the COPD 360 social network, the system involved there. People are asking, how do you transfer oxygen if you move to another state? And people who have done that are able to contribute answers. Do you ever get dry eyes from using oxygen? And again, people can share their experience so that you know that you're not the only person that's gone through that, and you can talk to somebody who's been on that journey and has an answer for you. Are there support for patients who are embarrassed by their oxygen? We know that that's a big issue out there and why we have to do that education in the general public. But again, you are not alone in these experiences, particularly that last one. I wanted to throw that in there. I know that's not always the most pleasant thing to talk about, but people are starting oxygen, and we know that the communication isn't always there. When you get your oxygen set up, you're not always getting your questions answered. You're not always getting the support that you need, and it can legitimately be terrifying. Obviously, this person was very concerned about their issues, and those are things that we've heard. Sometimes you get these tanks dropped off and you get all the doom and gloom because you have to be safe and careful with it, but you don't get that support. And that's what Oxygen 360 is all about. That's what COPD 360 Social is all about. That's what our Facebook page, our Instagram feed, everything. That's what we're all about. And we're here to support you. And as John said, make this your program. One last thing here, one of our newest initiatives. We actually got a registration link for it earlier today. We're going to be hosting, in addition to these periodic Facebook Lives that right now we're looking at doing about 4 times a year, we're angling to do monthly virtual coffee hours where you can actually have a little bit more interaction. This is kind of a support and relaxation, and all these, if there are questions that you need answered that we don't get to today, or that you don't think of until tomorrow or the next day, you can register for our Oxy Talk virtual coffee hours. Our first one is coming up in about 2 weeks. That date doesn't look right for being 2 weeks from today, but I'll have to double check that. It is 2 weeks from today on a Wednesday. I think I might have just looked at the calendar wrong. It must be the 24th.
I think you're right, Mike.
Today's May 12th. No, it's the 14 days.
Yeah.
My math is wrong. That's
Yeah.
what it is. I haven't had enough coffee in my coffee hour today. It is Wednesday, May 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern. That will be on a platform called Zoom that probably over the last year, many of us are somewhat familiar with. That's just a place where we can talk to some other people who are using oxygen and get those tips and tricks handy, and just share those experiences with everybody. And also, just a quick shout out before we get into the educational piece here today. Stephanie and Brett, my colleagues, our colleagues at the foundation weighing in, and Stephanie putting my mind at ease that the 26th is in fact correct. So, also, we are seeing that we're getting a lot of comments coming in. So please keep those coming. Everything that we see here today, we might not be able to acknowledge immediately, but we will get a response at some point. And we do appreciate any questions. We're going to get the question and answer at the end of the session here, but we do have a lot of stuff to get on with here. So, John, anything else you want to wrap up with Oxygen360 before we start talking about some of the basics?
No, well, just one clarification. At first you had said 4 times a year, and then you said monthly. There are 12 months in the year. So I just want to make sure that the listeners aren't confused.
Our Facebook events like this one are currently scheduled for 4 times a year. We're going to do once a quarter. But because we know that we need a little bit more engagement, we want people to be a little bit better supported. We do want to do those coffee hours on a monthly basis. So once you sign up for one, we'll be able to get more information about how to register for future ones. And of course, those will be on our event calendar. So
Perfect.
We're going to take 2 different approaches here because not everybody wants to do that fully interactive kind of thing, but we also want to make sure that we're reaching people as much as we possibly can. So Thank you for clarifying. All right. So again, we see that a lot of times people get oxygen and aren't always told why. That was one of the things that when we were first launching this, I heard a lot from folks in the community that said, well, when I first got this, wasn't really told why I was on it. I was told to stick this thing in my nose and play with the dial a little bit, and that was about that. So let's do a little bit of review about how oxygen works inside of your body. We're going to go from this again at a couple of different angles. So John is here to keep me, you know us in the us medical folks. We like to throw our, as our president Ruth likes to say, our $10 words out there. And of course, we can never say anything in 2 syllables when we can say it in 15. So John's here to help make sure that I stay a little bit on track with keeping things understandable. And we're going to jump right into a slide that is probably almost incoherent. We always have this thought in my house that there's a cliche that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and that's actually true. And that is where oxygen, at its very core scientific cellular level, that's where oxygen comes into play. Oxygen merges with glucose or sugar and creates this thing called ATP, which is the energy that your cells need to function. So at a very basic level, oxygen is one of the main fuels for your body to create the process where everything goes. And then on the flip side of that, because everything, anytime you have any kind of metabolism or body function or anything like that, you've got to have some waste products. That's where carbon dioxide comes in. I'm sure a lot of folks out there are very familiar with, as my respiratory instructors used to call it, the good air in when you're breathing in the oxygen, and then the bad air out when you're blowing out the carbon dioxide. And that's kind of how that's what this process is. John, I think you've probably got a little bit of a better way to analogize that a little bit for folks out there.
Well, I can't even remember. I've heard this from more than one person, but it was my aha moment when I really understood why I need oxygen and what it does for me, and why sometimes if we're out of shape and get up and walk across the room or go out to get the mail from the mailbox and we just can't breathe. Well, the oxygen is what fuels your body, just like gasoline or diesel is what fuels your car. And if your car is out of tune, it's going to chug along. It's not going to go as far, and it's going to use a lot more gas. We use oxygen. But if you have a car that's well tuned, it purrs along smoothly. It goes a lot further using less gas. So if we are out of shape, that's why we're chugging along and burning oxygen that we don't even have because we can't get it in because we have lung problems. Whereas if we're in shape, if our muscles are in tune and toned, it doesn't take as much energy, ATP from the previous slide. It doesn't take as much of the oxygen, the fuel, the gas to do that. So once I grasped, I get it now. It's just like a car. Am I a fine-tuned Cadillac purring down the road? Or am I that clunker that I wish the neighbors would sell that sits in the driveway and sputters down the road every once in a while? So that's the analogy that I use.
Well, I think that leads us really well into our next set of slides here, because it's also very common as an RT. I hear this a lot where people figure that, well, if I'm short of breath, I just need more oxygen. I need more fuel. But I think your analogy of making sure that everything is finely tuned, I think that really sets the stage for our next couple of slides here, because that really is the key. That's why things like pulmonary rehabilitation programs work well, because they kind of help tune things up. Because as we'll see here, not everything is always about just the amount of oxygen that you're getting. So we're going to have a little bit of an animation here. Hopefully it'll work out okay. These are, of course, your lungs. Everybody is familiar, or hopefully is familiar with the general layout of your lungs, or can at least recognize these. Seeing a comment out there that people do need education about their equipment and stuff right from the beginning, and that's absolutely true. So I don't want to assume that everybody is aware of all the fine details and everything here, but these are your lungs. But what they also can be kind of related to is they're kind of a train station. And if we look at your lungs as the main station here, we'll also see this train rolling in here with a bunch of boxcars. Now, those boxcars have HGB on there. That's short for hemoglobin. Those are your red blood cells. And when those red blood cells pull into lung station here, they get loaded up with oxygen molecules like that. They go in, and of course your carbon dioxide gets blown off here too, but we're going to focus on oxygen just a little bit. Once those get loaded up into your hemoglobin boxcars, then they go rolling out to the rest of the cells in your body so that they can provide that fuel for everything to work well. Of course, that's the way things work in the perfect system here. Looks like I accidentally duplicated this slide. In the live show, there's always something that kind of goes awry. But sometimes, of course, we have a variety of transfer issues of getting that oxygen cargo into the hemoglobin boxcars. We start out, we're going to do a little bit of medical stuff here so that hopefully when a clinician throws some of these phrases at you, they'll at least not be the first time you've heard them, and you'll at least say, well, I've heard that before. I'm at least comfortable enough to go back and look that up. It's not a completely different language. We see in your lungs, we've got these little air sacs called alveoli. That's really where a lot of the transfer happens, where that oxygen goes across into the bloodstream, and so on and so forth. We see at the top here, you've got these healthy air sacs that kind of look like a bunch of grapes. But then as you go down and get into some of the damage that sometimes we see in things like COPD and other respiratory lung conditions, other breathing problems, they kind of merge together a little bit, and there's less interior surface space for that to go onto. And again, John, doing his part to keep me on the straight and narrow here, said, that's kind of complicated. Let's see if we can narrow that down a little bit. And it's also true, this is another one of those things that going way back to what I learned in respiratory school. If you were to stretch out every bit of your alveoli, every bit of those little air sacs, the surface area of that would be about the size of a tennis court. But once you start consolidating some of those, smashing them down a little bit, sometimes you get down to the size of perhaps a pickleball court. Now, of course, if you're trying to push something through something the size of a tennis court, it's going to be a lot harder and less efficient to get that through the size of a pickleball court. And so sometimes just losing that surface area, that area for transfer to happen, that makes things more difficult. We also see a lot of folks start producing a lot of junk, a lot of mucus, a lot of phlegm. We put a lot of different names on it, but whatever it is, it's that goop that you tend to cough up. Or John, you had mentioned mucus plugs. Excuse me. You had mentioned talking about mucus plugs and things like that. And sometimes when you have the damage to those air sacs plus all that mucus in here, we can kind of see when you breathe in that that's that left side, that inspiration, you can get around that mucus plug a little bit okay, and then fill up your little air sacs there. But then when you breathe out, sometimes the walls to those airways collapse and stuff gets trapped in there. And if you've ever tried to pour water into a glass, you know that you can pour a lot less if there's already water in the glass, right? So we call that air trapping, where we're not able to get any of that fresh air in because we've got that stale air that's already trapped. And so what ends up happening is because we don't have as many of those oxygen molecules moving, when we see our hemoglobin boxcars pulling into the station, there aren't as many. We'll see if I can pause it in the right time here. Whoops, I was just supposed to pause, not restart everything. We can see that, well, it's just going to give me an issue there. Hopefully you can see though, that we're not seeing as many of the molecules fall into those boxcars, and they're not as full as they should be. And for those of you who have used a pulse oximeter before, that little thing that goes on your finger, that's what that is measuring. How full are your boxcars? If they're completely full, then that thing will read 100%. If they're only half full, you'll probably be realizing that, but it'll only read 50%. And then of course, anywhere in between. And then there are some other issues that can go wrong with airflow and transferring those oxygen molecules across. Sometimes, in the case of conditions like what we call an interstitial lung disease or pulmonary fibrosis, interstitial basically just means between. So we're seeing problems between the air sacs or between the air sac and the blood flow. We see that the wall is thicker basically, and it's a lot harder for those molecules to get across. You can see inside the very fancy diagram here in the top, we see the bunch of grapes of your alveoli air sacs again, and you see that loop of the oxygen getting in and the carbon dioxide getting out. But in the bottom, where you see the walls getting thicker because of that fibrosis or that in-between disease there, that wall gets a lot thicker, and it's a lot harder for the oxygen to get across into that that space. And so we can see that kind of with our boxcars here, because now we have this thing called low diffusion or low, those of you who have had a pulmonary function test, you may have seen that number, that DLCO measurement. That's basically a measure of how well that oxygen is getting across into the bloodstream. And we see on our boxcars here, we kind of get that cloud there that's stopping a bunch of that. And some of those boxcars might get filled up, but we also see that there's a lot going across that they're just getting exhaled again. Now, John, could you weigh in a minute on how important looking at that DLCO may be for somebody with COPD as well?
I suppose, I mean, just everyone, and it's somewhat bothersome because everyone, including myself, for so long refers to, well, what's your lung function? And they're really asking, what's your FEV1%? Because that's how, when we patients talk amongst ourselves, I only have 32% lung function. Well, what does that mean? Your lung has a lot of functions. If you look at your pulmonary function test, there's FEV, FVC, FEV/FVC 2550, 25/75. There are many readings. Just to reiterate what Mike said, diffusion is how well your lungs put the oxygen you are inhaling into the bloodstream. At least that's the way I describe it. And Mike will correct me if I'm not speaking clinically correct. But for example, myself, my FEV 1% is about 22. I'm very severe, stage 4. But my DLCO isn't that bad. It's not good, but it's not that bad. So what I am able to breathe in diffuses or transfers to Mike's little train station. Woo! And Casey Jones and all of his little hemoglobins deliver it through my body better than someone else. So that may be why, like, I'm not wearing oxygen right now, and many of you might be thinking, FEV1 22%, and he's not wearing oxygen. Well, trust me, folks, it's right here, and I do need it when I get up and about. So there's a lot more to lung function than just FEV1%. I think DLCO is equally as important as FEV1 in my daily living. And I'll let Mike tell me if I'm maybe misconstruing that, because again, I'm not a clinician.
No, I think that is better than I could possibly have explained it. So I think you're right on. We have historically focused a lot on FEV1, but hopefully now that there's some other some easier technologies out there that might make it a little bit more convenient for people to measure DLCO. And again, to speak a little bit about the elephant in the room of the current pandemic, I know we're also seeing some of those folks who are in the recovery phase from COVID are also seeing issues with their DLCO over time. So I'm hopeful that we can start having a little bit more of a broader focus instead of just that one number, and looking at, as you said, how all of the lung functions are working together. So wholeheartedly agree with you on that. And not only is it just lung stuff, but sometimes we have to look at how the heart is doing too, because sometimes you just don't have enough boxcars. You can fill them up as much as you want, but if you don't have enough, then you're just going to get some of that same spillover that we saw in the last slide. And we see these things in cases where you might have like anemia, where you don't have enough of the hemoglobin, the molecules themselves, or even things like pulmonary hypertension, which is a pressure problem inside the vessels that service the lungs, where you have that high pressure in there, and which restricts some of that blood flow, and then you're not able to fill up enough of those boxcars. You're not getting those numbers in there. And of course, we've got a little animation about that too, where instead of 4 boxcars, now we see that there's only 2 pulling into the station here, 2 hemoglobins going in there. And again, those are full. Those are going to read 100% on your pulse ox, but you just don't have enough of them to go around to really meet your needs. And so all of this really relates into this question here of, why am I short of breath? And one of the big takeaways, I think, and John, tell me if you disagree with this, but I think we need to really focus on the idea that shortness of breath and low pulse oximetry readings, those pulse ox numbers from your finger, they're not always related. You can't always count on being short of breath as an indicator that your oxygen is low. And conversely, or speaking the opposite way, you may be very short of breath and your oxygen, or you may be perfectly not short of breath and your oxygen is very low. You can have all of these issues going together where you're not getting enough airflow, you're not getting enough of that good air in and the bad air out. Maybe you don't have enough of the hemoglobin boxcars. Maybe you're having those transfer issues. Maybe the blood flow is not appropriate. You talked a little bit about going from rest to going to activity. Well, all of a sudden the blood has to start pumping a lot and the train's going a lot faster. Might not have time to pick up all the oxygen there.
I
So
think I just want to add, Mike, that I think this is something that's very critical, that you need to just have this conversation with your care provider, with your physician, because I have no clinical training at all, and I would say, well, gosh, maybe you're out of shape and you need to go to pulmonary rehab. But you know, for all, because I don't know you, nobody knows you except you and your doctor. Maybe you have a heart issue. Maybe there's a cardiac problem involved. Maybe you have pulmonary hypertension. Maybe you're a CO2 retainer. There are so many possible reasons that this slide could happen, where my standard answer would be go to rehab. You're just out of shape. And I could be dead wrong.
well, I'm glad you mentioned the idea of a carbon dioxide or CO2 retainer, because that was actually a question that did pop up in the Facebook feed. You know, sometimes when you have the damage that's related to COPD or some other conditions, some of that lung damage, you're just not able to get that stale air, that old air, that waste gas out. And then that stays in there. And if you go all the way back to chemistry class, and we won't go into any of those details because that was a long time ago for me, but eventually some of that carbon dioxide either gets reabsorbed into your bloodstream, or since it's existing in the air sacs anyway, it can't get out in the first place. And so it just kind of keeps flowing along and flowing along and flowing along. And so a lot of these people, a lot of the people who have problems with airflow, that obstruction, like in COPD, and you can't exhale properly, you get that buildup of carbon dioxide, and then that messes with some of your blood chemistry, and that changes some of your other body body systems. So I don't know if that exactly answers the question that came through about trying to explain that CO2 retaining or not, but hopefully that can at least get us start that conversation a little bit, and I'm sure we'd be happy to go into a little bit more detail if we need to.
And I would just quickly add that the people would sometimes say, well, if I'm a CO2 retainer, what can I do about it? Well, other than intervention with, for example, a Trilogy machine or other type of non-invasive ventilator, what can you as a patient do? First, slip breathing. We don't have time to go into all of that now, but there are videos on YouTube. The foundation, the COP Foundation, has good reference material on it. But pursed slip breathing is a great way to build back pressure so you can exhale more of the trapped air and at least help get some of the CO2 out. It's not going to cure you if you're a retainer, but it's what you can do.
Yes. And John mentioned a minute ago, you know, that we, you know, we're faces on Facebook. We have our presentation, all that sort of thing. We can't necessarily tell you exactly what's going on with your lungs, or exactly what if you need oxygen or not. So then that brings up the question is, how do you know if you need oxygen therapy? And that is where, again, your clinical team comes into play, whether it's a physician, a nurse practitioner, a physician assistant, whoever it is. If you're suspicious that you might need oxygen, if you're having shortness of breath a lot, all that sort of thing, talk to them about it, because one of the things that they may have you do, or they should have you do, is have you walk around their office space or their clinic space for a little bit. And this is called an oxygen titration test. A lot of times we'll call it a 6-minute walk test, but there's a little bit of confusion in the clinical world there, because that is actually a measure of how far you can walk in 6 minutes, not necessarily whether you lose oxygen in precisely 6 minutes. Because I don't know about you folks, but I tend to be in my house for more than 6 minutes at a time. And so we don't necessarily get a really good read on whether you individually, personally may need oxygen over a set window like that. So if you're feeling like you're getting short of breath and that sort of thing, again, talk to your clinician. See if you can challenge yourself a little bit. A lot of places you may just kind of walk around a single level for a few minutes. But if your house has stairs, if you're carrying laundry up and down, if you're doing these activities of daily living, try to make sure that your oxygen test kind of represents what you do in your daily life. Because I've seen it personally myself, where somebody will come in and do the walk for a few minutes and they saturate just fine. and then they go home and, they've got their laundry is downstairs in the basement. So they got to take a load down, do their laundry, bring it back up. It's heavy. They're really short of breath, all these issues. When we have them walking down a flight of stairs, then their saturation drops. So all this time we've just figured, well, it must just be something quirky, and we could have been helping with that therapy there. We are looking for that oxygen saturation to drop to 88% or less. That's what Medicare has currently decided as the cutoff for oxygen therapy. And then a lot of our commercial payers kind of go along with that. And that's the rule. If you're at that at rest, then you can get oxygen continuously. If you do that at an activity, then you get portable oxygen to carry around with you and use it in those conditions. We can actually do that also by drawing some blood from your wrist, called an arterial blood gas measurement, that comes from an artery that is fully oxygenated straight from the lungs. That's not as commonly done as having somebody walk around with the oximeter, because it is a little bit more painful, a little bit more challenging. But sometimes you can get evaluated in the hospital toward the end of your stay, and then that can be done as well in that setting. So there are some tests that can be done. Again, talk to your clinician about how to get involved in that process. And then once you're on oxygen, how do you tell if it's working? And these are some questions that the research aspects of Oxygen360 would maybe like to address as we get into some of the meat of the project here. First and foremost is, should you test regularly? I'll say the clinician perspective is probably should test fairly regularly if you have, and this is something I've kind of evolved on a little bit myself, but I would be in favor of somewhat regular testing. But John, I'll leave it to you to give us some context about what you feel regular testing should be, if it should be done at all.
I'll tell you guys the honest truth. I'm a techie. I like gadgets. I've got, and I have manufacturers that send me things and they want me to evaluate them. And sometimes I got to keep them. Most of the time I have to send them back, but I just enjoy the technology. So I've got about every gadget under the sun. But when I was a patient at Mayo Clinic, Dr. Roberto Benzo, who I greatly admire, and I consider him a friend of mine now, Roberto said, John, it's good and it's important to know your numbers, but don't get hung up on them. Live your life. And I thought about that, and that really makes sense. I'm not going to keep, I'm not telling any of you what to do, but I don't want to keep a spreadsheet. I don't want to log everything constantly. And, thank God for Bluetooth, because now when I use these gizmos, they just record to my phone and I can share it with my doctor if I wish, but don't get hung up on them. If you're feeling, gosh, I wonder if I should turn my oxygen up, well then, yeah, put on the pulse oximeter and see if you need to, but also be aware if you're a retainer or not. I mean, you have to always consult with your physician. I'm not giving medical advice, but know your numbers. It's important. Maybe you need to turn your oxygen up or down, assuming your doctor has told you you can. Know your numbers, but don't get hung up on them. Don't live your life. It's too short, just live your life.
Well, I brought the other two bullet points up on the screen because you kind of touched on both of those a little bit. Again, it's important to recognize, or try to recognize, what's shortness of breath because of some of the other issues that we were talking about with the boxcars, and what is actually low oxygen. So those are great times to check your oxygen level. And then we also had a question come in that talked about, is there such a thing as too much O2? And I think you were alluding to that a little bit, John, when you were talking about being an oxygen retainer. Again, I'll give you yes, excuse me.
Gotta keep you on the straight and narrow here.
Probably good to retain a little bit of oxygen.
I would hope.
In any event, though, the idea of too much oxygen is something that we could probably spend an entire session just on this, because there was one study that was done about 60 years ago, I think, with about a dozen people, that talked about how there were people there in certain people, if you give people too much oxygen, it will make them breathe less. And so there was this whole idea, what we call the hypoxic drive theory. It was one of those things that at a right place, right time, whatever, or abundance of caution, I don't know, but it just kind of became clinical gospel for the subsequent years. And nobody questioned it up until maybe about 10 to 15 years ago. And then we started wondering, is that really a thing? And the question, again, it gets very complicated. As a general rule, and again, this is not specific medical advice to anybody, and this is again that somebody's coming in with, can or a CO2 retainer really die if oxygen turned up too high while sleeping? As a general rule, you will not lose your drive to breathe if you have more oxygen than you're used to. But again, it's the same kind of thing in that, as a general rule, you'll be fine if you eat peanuts. But there are certain people who are not fine if they eat peanuts. And so there are certain people who are not fine if they use too much oxygen. It's not necessary. Again, we get into the chemistry and the physics, and it's some of it is over my head even. So I couldn't even begin to try and explain it. But as a general rule, work to your oxygen saturation. If you're comfortable at 92%, you're comfortable at 92%. You don't have to try for 98% or anything like that. But go to those areas where it's most comfortable for you. Because again, if nothing else, especially if you're on a portable system, you're going to run out of literal gas a lot faster if you try to turn it up and get those high numbers that aren't necessarily your target. And speaking of targets, John, you mentioned this a little bit. Everybody gets a fixed prescription. The prescription guidelines say you get a certain liter flow at rest, a certain liter flow with activity, and a certain liter flow
At sleep.
At sleep. Thank you. There has been a little bit of a push to, because we've gotten to the idea, for example, in metabolic medicine and diabetes care, we allow people to have a little bit more self-control over their insulin levels and the medications they take for those things. So is it conceivable to do that also with oxygen? And again, I'll go clinically first. I'll say I'm a proponent of that. I trust people. You know what your body is doing far more than I do. And I think it's okay to trust people to self-manage, assuming, again, we've provided enough education that people are comfortable with that, and that we're comfortable with that as clinicians, and that everybody is comfortable. John, what would you say from the patient perspective?
I would say everyone has to discuss it with their doctor, because I don't know what their prescriptions are. But too often on any social media, I've seen, well, someone will say, well, if you're short of breath, turn your oxygen up. And 18 people will chime in, you can't do that. You can't do that without talking to your doctor. And to that, I agree. You need to talk to your doctor, but to not being able to turn it up, to quote Colonel Potter from MASH, horse bucky. Tell your doctor, hey, look, doc, you tell me to be at 3 liters. I'm just picking numbers. If I'm like walking really fast to keep up with my family and I'm really short of breath, and if I put my pulse oximeter on and it says I'm down to 87, 86, can I jack it up a little bit? If he's worth his degree, he'll say, well, of course you can. Just turn it back down once you've calmed down, once you've settled down. I haven't heard of a doctor that won't allow you to have some flexibility. There may be situations where he really doesn't want you to, but that's why you need to have that conversation. But, I'm going to quote a good advocate friend of mine, Jean Romas. She said, well, look at the doctor and say, well, then why is it okay for me to be at 88 or 89, but you're at 94, 95? I think that's, well, what about me?
Yeah.
What about me? I'm trying to live my life, and oxygen's not going to, unless I'm in a certain condition, it's really not going to hurt me.
As a clinician, I would want you to be breathing as close to how I breathe as I possibly can. You have the right to breathe, or
Yeah.
you have it's fair for you to expect me to do whatever I can to get you as breathing as easy as possible. So,
In fact, I'm just going to give another shout out and quote Grace Ann Doherty Koppel and her husband Ted Koppel were on the CBS morning show some years ago, and she had the best quote. It was about COPD, and the anchor said, "Well, Grace Ann, what is it that you COPD patients want?" And she said, "We want to breathe. All we want to do is breathe." And that really wrapped up the whole thing, because that is all we want.
absolutely. So we're going to get into a little bit about oxygen equipment. We're kind of coming up on the end of our scheduled time, which I'm comfortable running a little bit over. John, I don't want to obligate you to anything, but I want to.
I'm here for all of them. No, and for you.
If it seems like we're going to rush through some of this stuff, we're not really intending to quote unquote rush through it, but we are going to be covering a lot of these things in some of our future events too. So we're going to touch on just some of the very basics of this equipment. On the screen here, we see the standard oxygen tank, the oxygen cylinder that's available in various sizes. Some of them are, shall we say, more portable than others, but they all have a certain amount of compressed oxygen gas inside of them. They come with a device called a regulator on there. Sometimes they give you a continuous amount of flow. Sometimes they have what's called a pulse dose. John, I think you mentioned this a little bit earlier today or during the presentation, where you'll get kind of a little puff as you breathe in, and that gives you the oxygen dose as you're inhaling. But in any event, all of these are the gas form of oxygen compressed down and stored into one of these cylinders so that you get a certain amount of time to have them be portable or as a potential backup system for some of the other systems that we talk about here. For example, the old school, new school, both school.
The only
The only school oxygen concentrator, much like we saw at the very beginning. Sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. These are devices that will sit in the home or that have wheels, and so they're technically they're mobile. I won't say they're portable, but they're mobile. And these don't have they aren't limited by their capacity, but they're limited by their power cord and an energy source. These generally are just continuous flow. There are some that have some additional features, like there are some that you can actually use the concentration part of it to fill some of the portable cylinders, so that you don't have to, you're not as reliant upon your equipment provider or anything like that. But again, they're just kind of generally machine that sits there and pumps oxygen out to you. And John, do you have any other pithy, insightful comments for that?
it's just so basic. I mean, you either have a tank or I mean, we won't even get into locks, but it is what it is. So.
And then the last key component here is what's called it's a portable version of these concentrators that are limited by battery life in most cases. Some of them you can either run them on battery or have them plugged into the wall. Some people do have these for their home device and their active device. These generally are limited to relatively low flow, continuous flow. So as you start to get more, you get more oxygen demand need, you need higher flows of oxygen. They're not always the best choice, but they also do generate that pulse flow for you. So really, we don't do this enough, in my opinion. As a clinician, there's a lot of stuff I think we don't do as much as we should, but these are the kind of things that you should definitely attempt to try before you buy, so to speak. And as you get prescribed these devices, see which one works for your needs and your lifestyle as much as possible. It doesn't always necessarily mean that that's what you're going to get, because there are a lot of other factors involved. But there are one size fits a fair number of people solutions that one of these can usually work for you. And again, Again, I know we went through this stuff kind of quickly, but this is again where our guide for better living for oxygen therapy can come into play, which does go into a lot more detail about not only some of the equipment that you can get, the concentrators and the tanks and so on and so forth, but also the types of what we call interfaces, or the way that you get the oxygen delivered to your body, the tubings, the cannulas, that sort of thing. So again, you can try to find the solution that works best for you. These go again, it goes into a little bit more detail about some of the advantages and disadvantages of each system. And it's again just a fantastic reference that a whole bunch of people at the foundation have really worked hard to get out and modernize and do so fairly quickly, so that we can provide the education that we need to for people who either are new to oxygen or never got that education to begin with. And that does bring us close to the end here. Um, John, I like to look at this as a new day for oxygen. I think the Oxygen 360 program, of course, I'm a little biased, but I think this is a really exciting opportunity to bring together a whole bunch of people who have been interested in oxygen and who have seen the need for it, or the need for improvement and renovation, so to speak, but haven't necessarily had the framework or the structure to do that with. And so hopefully that's the thing that we can provide by talking to our new minds that are out there, by developing some of these research things to figure out who does benefit the most from oxygen, who is at risk for those oxygen issues. How do we collaborate with other groups? How do we work together with policymakers and advocacy groups and industry people? How do we make these new devices? How do we create the better mousetrap, so to speak? We're going to be doing these events on a regular basis. We're going to have our coffee hours. And then, of course, your best way to get involved is either to go to our COPD 360 social page and get involved in that community, or simply tell us your stories. If you want to be anonymous, you can be anonymous. If you want to put your name out there, we're happy to honor whatever stories we get at Oxygen 360 at copdfoundation.org. So that we can make this work for everybody.
And send us your ideas. I have my ideas, and even though this is the launch of inviting you to join us, Mike and I have already been hard at it. Mike attended a tech summit where he spoke about our program and made some contacts. I had some other contacts, researchers and mentors I've worked with, and Mike and I have already been on the phone, one-on-one with these people, discussing, what they're doing. Because in my mind, what I would love, just to give you an example, how would an oxygen concentrator best work? Well, it would be portable. It would give me enough oxygen, and I could have maybe a Fitbit type device, or something that I didn't have to wear on my finger, that would link to the oxygen concentrator, that would automatically titrate my oxygen up and down depending on my needs. To me, that's a no-brainer, but that's just the beginning. So we want to do these things, but it's for me because I'm a patient, but it's for you. So send us your ideas, your issues, your success stories, why oxygen is important to you, what issues you have. And we can't solve everyone's problem, but we're sure going to try.
And we have seen some of those questions already flowing in through Facebook. We had somebody ask earlier, what would be an ideal weight for a concentrator, or how much lighter would be helpful? People asking, I suspect these may be some of our partners in the industry. What do you find to be hard to use about your current portable oxygen concentrators? So these questions, this is also a conduit for a lot of folks to for a lot of, again, everybody at the table, whether they're the innovators, the new idea people, whether there are people who are already working in manufacturing and distributing, whether they are folks like you who are users of oxygen. This is a way for all of us to get together, get these questions answered, and get again, make a new day for folks in the oxygen community.
Oh, if we have industry people on the call today, which I hope we do, I'm going to quote John Walsh. because I welcome you to the table. Come to the table with us. Because as
Absolutely.
John Walsh said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
And it's not about us without us was another one of the things that he said very commonly. And
I use that
that
all the time.
absolutely. And I mean, there's not really nothing more that can be said than that. I said before, I would much rather take action based on answers than assumptions, you know, and I don't have COPD. I don't use oxygen. So all I have are assumptions. So I need to know what that actual information is.
Do we have time for questions, Mike?
I have time for questions. So I threw the slide up here, and I probably should have put the disclaimer up a while back, but I did think to put it on here that we are not a substitute for medical advice. We're happy to answer questions generally, but should not be used for your own personal medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. And we also welcome any personal experiences, but please don't make any changes to your management plan based on something the faces on the internet said. It did have one question that came in. Brett relayed this to us. Will we be covering portable oxygen concentrators? And so you saw we kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'll give you a little bit of a preview coming up in November. Well, I'll give you a look ahead a little bit here. August is going to be our next webinar or next Facebook Live event like this. We're going to be covering, our theme is Oxygen Mythbusters, where we're going to handle some of the questions that are out there. We'll probably revisit that. Can you get too much oxygen? Things like, can you get addicted to oxygen? We'll be covering some of those things. That'll be our webinar, our Facebook Live for August. And then in November, to celebrate COPD Awareness Month, we have our entire Facebook Live will be dedicated to all the ins and outs of portable concentrators. We're angling for some experts in the field to come in on the equipment side, on the user side. Hopefully, John had a good enough experience here. He'll stick around for us. But stay tuned. We'll be covering portable concentrators in depth in a few months. And then, of course, as those questions come up in our Oxy Talks and in other venues, we'll be happy to answer those as well. But in the meantime, we're happy to answer any other questions that might be coming along the line here. Let's see if I can hop in there for just a moment and see. Wow, there's a lot of comments that I'm seeing there. So that's great. Linda says, is this a video that can be watched again? Yes. This will be a thing that we will usually lives on Facebook, and then we'll edit out a couple minutes at the beginning, a couple minutes at the end to make it a little bit cleaner. And we'll also be putting this on our YouTube page and our Oxygen360 page on our foundation website. This is probably also a good time since I'm on that page right here. We can also throw this is our link coming up for dropping into the comments right there. That's our link to register for our upcoming May Oxy Talk. I can see that pop in there. And let me see if I can also get a link to our Oxygen360 page. There's that. We can drop this in the comments too. And then that also has our contact information in there, that oxygen360@copdfoundation.org email address, so that if you want to reach out after the fact here, if you have any other questions or want to address things privately, we're always welcome to honor that. And I do see a good comment. David mentions, of course, we are addicted to oxygen. You can't live without it. That's yes, oxygen retention, oxygen addiction. It is awfully one of the. I know this is the trifecta of stuff I learned in respiratory school, but one of the very first things we watched a video from our advocacy organization, the AARC, that pointed out that you can go in many cases. Of course, everybody's a little different. You can go usually a couple of weeks without food. You can usually go a couple of days without water, but you're only going to make it a couple of minutes without oxygen, without breathing. So oxygen is definitely an important aspect of that. On my end, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting through to some of the older comments, so I'm counting on Brett and Stephanie to keep us
I
updated
was
here.
I was scrolling back to see if I could find any, and I was delighted to see that we have Bob McCoy on board here, and he said great presentation. So
Oh, thank
thank
you
you,
very much.
Bob. That's a
Yes,
praise from high above.
absolutely. We'll go ahead and we'll get our faces back up on the screen here.
Oh no.
Um, not seeing a whole lot of additional comments coming in. We'll give it another minute here as we start wrapping things up. But really appreciate everybody coming out and spending some of your Wednesday. I think it's safe to say afternoon, at least throughout North America here. Part of your Wednesday with us, learning about oxygen, learning about the Oxygen 360 program, something we are tremendously excited about. And as John mentioned, we've been able to make some connections already and make some progress and build some momentum. But we're really just getting started. So we've got some exciting things that are coming up in the next few months. And I'm really looking forward to having everybody involved and making this a project that works for you.
See, our theme song should be from the Carpenters. We've only just begun.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely.
I mean, this is the launch, even though we've already been hard at it. But everyone, send your letters, send your stories, send your ideas, your problems, your successes, but also tell your fellow lung sufferers, COPD or whatever your lung condition is, to follow us and to join us next time. I can't do all of the promotion. The foundation can't do, well, they can, but it's about the patient. And I always say, and I know I'm right, patients listen to other patients sometimes more so than they listen to their doctor. So if you tell your fellow patients, hey, do they have something going here and they need our help, bring them on board. We're going to make this happen. But there's strength in numbers. And that's why we need all of you and your friends and their friends. I know I sound like a multi-level marketing guru, but let's do this. Join us. Thanks.
Absolutely. Saw a couple more coming in. Looked like Dr. Casaburi joined us for a little bit. So thank you. And thought this was a good presentation. So thank you, Dr. Casaburi, one of the leading pulmonologists in the country. So one person asked, will you be notified on upcoming Facebook Lives? If you follow us, follow the COPD Foundation Facebook page, you will definitely get updates for not only oxygen talks or oxygen presentations, but all of our great events that are coming up. And then we also have a couple of different newsletters that you can access through the foundation and sign up for those and get notified of some upcoming events. I saw a question about growing lung tissue in mice. That is, and so the question then was, what about us? What about humans? And of course, absolutely, the hope is that someday we can get to that point. But one of those things that we all have to understand is we'll throw John Walsh out there again, as he was the original impatient patient, as I've heard him described many times. We can't be too impatient about some of these things, because there are still a lot of groups out there that are ready and willing and just about to hop on board with taking advantage of impatience. There are a lot of groups that are selling a lot of things, that are promoting a lot of things, that yes, we can regrow this, or yes, we can generate that. And we just have to be very mindful that when we're doing things in mice and rats and those kinds of experiments, those are very early phase research projects. And oftentimes what works in that genome or that bio process doesn't always translate to people. So the hope is there and the optimism is there, but we just have to really be cautious when we're seeing those things, that it's unfortunately, I always hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's going to be a while yet before we're at that point. So I think that probably catches us up. John, any closing words for us here? Any more closing words, I should say?
No, just to expand on what you just said. I mean, because I've sat on peer review as a patient reviewer, and I know some of the research that's being done. When she mentioned the mouse lung, that specifically, probably she was asking about stem cells. And I think that that's going to really be a big boon and a help to us, but it is down the road. The
Yes.
murine level or the mouse level, they're exploring how the scaffolding of the lung is built. They're doing experiments, and there's hope. Now, of course, there's hope, but it's not
And
ready. It's not ready for prime time. We're not there yet. It's still several years off. But boy, it's the research is being done.
And we do have a very spot on comment from actually somebody I know here in Michigan, Linda. She says, we're impatient because we've been waiting for breakthroughs for years. And
Yeah.
that is 1000% fair. It goes all the way back to the beginning of our presentation where we see that the structure of the oxygen concentrator hasn't changed since at least 1986 and probably going all the way back into those 70s with Bendix and Union Carbide and those very original devices. It is unfair. It's not right. And that's why we're hoping to change that curve here, and do better. Not really anything else that can be said. We need to do better, and that's what we're here for.
So, folks, don't let I said this once at a conference. Everyone's enthusiastic, but enthusiasm wanes so quickly. You go back to the office Monday, or you wake up tomorrow morning and have your coffee, and yeah, I went to a webinar yesterday. Don't let that happen. Stay with us. Let's work together. Let's make this happen. We can do this. We,
Stay with us.
You and I, all of us, we can do this.
Stay with us. Follow us on Facebook. And contact us. Everybody who is emailing oxygen360@copdfoundation.org will be acknowledged and will be added, and we'll keep you informed on updated stuff. Follow us on all the various social media channels. Just keep reaching out, keep us updated on what's going on with you, keep us updated on what you need, and we will keep this momentum going.
And thanks for sticking with us for 80 minutes. we tend to get verbose, but anyway, I hope you guys got as much out of it as we had fun telling you.
Absolutely. So thank you, John, for sticking with us and for all your work so far on the project.
Thank you for tolerating me.
It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing what we do next.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Brett and Stephanie, and thanks everybody who joined us today. And we will see you next time. Take care, everybody.
Bye, everybody.